This is the Digital Factory Podcast. I'm Jon Bruner. Today we're continuing to talk about the sustainability of 3D printing. In the last episode, I talked with Jeremy Faludi about 3D printing processes and how they have an impact on the environment. He's done a lot of research and came to the surprising conclusion that energy usage is the single biggest environmental factor for 3D printing, not materials, as a lot of us had probably assumed. Energy usage especially comes into play in the embodied energy within every printer and in the energy that printers consume while they idle and while they run. And the counterintuitive conclusion from all of that was that you can actually improve your environmental footprint by 3D printing more, which improves your utilization of the printer and reduces the amount of energy that you're spending on printer idling. Today, we're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about how 3D printing can drive a sustainable commercial strategy for manufacturers and product developers. You can use 3D printing to develop better products that perform more efficiently, that suit the market more effectively, that result in less waste and in happier customers as well. Before we get into the conversation, two quick reminders. First of all, the Digital Factory podcast is brought to you by Formlabs. The new Form 3 desktop SLA 3D printer uses a new process called low-force stereolithography to produce ultra-high quality parts from a wide range of materials quickly and efficiently. You can learn more about the Form 3 printer and about the materials and about all of Formlabs products at formlabs.com. Secondly, the videos from the Digital Factory conference back at the beginning of the summer are available at thedigitalfactory.com. You can watch all of them for free. We've got great keynotes, panels, and in-depth discussions that you can dive into and fill yourself in on industries as wide-ranging as aerospace and healthcare and automotive and logistics. It's a great lineup, and it's all there for free at thedigitalfactory.com. In fact, we're going to be making some of these talks available right here through the podcast feed. So if you take a look at your podcast app, you'll see that the first one came out along with this episode. Just switch over and listen to that. If you're interested in hearing a conversation between Rob Carter, the CIO of FedEx, and Jeff Immelt. They talk about a lot of great stuff, both technical and strategic, and you'll want to listen to that and check out the other videos at thedigitalfactory.com. My guest today is Zoé Bezpalko. She's the Sustainability and Strategy Manager at Autodesk. Great to have you on the program.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
So let's talk about kind of the strategy of sustainability and the way that it's becoming a priority for manufacturers today. There's been a lot of change, and sustainability seems to have arisen kind of as a risk management technique, but now it's actually becoming something that can drive companies. Can you tell us a little bit about what sustainability management is and how it's changed in the last few years?
Sure. Well, so at first, I think historically, sustainability has been, as you stated very well, a risk management strategy. So in the past, we've seen a lot of companies taking on more like EHS strategies and really thinking about reduction of pollutions and pollutants. And it was very much related to regulations in this field as well. And that's actually what I studied in school when I was as an environmental engineer. I started and everything was around EHS management and ISO 14.0 or 9.0. So today what we are seeing is there's a couple of trends happening on the field. The first one is really around the consumer pressure and consumer demand for more sustainable products. So maybe you've seen Greta Thunberg, this little teenager from Europe that started big protests in the field for climate and really starting to tell companies and government that they needed to move in the topic of climate. And I think that's representative of an entire generation that is asking more and more the bigger brands to be responsible. I think the plastic crisis is very illustrative as well. My good example is that I stopped shopping at Trader Joe probably 3 years ago because I thought they had too much packaging. A couple of months ago, I started my friends complaining on it on Facebook. A month later, Trader Joe made a statement that they would stop using plastic in their packaging. So we're seeing this trend of having more and more consumers that are taking on the topic of sustainability really at heart, and they are demanding more sustainable products, which in turn push companies and manufacturers to actually produce these. And I think that's an exciting move because instead of just things in the background for manufacturer or just reducing their pollution, now they are trying to put that at the forefront and showing the efforts that they are doing. And that's really moving the field from risk management to competitive advantage. If you are the first company that figure out how to make your packaging with zero plastic, you can promote that, you can market on it, and potentially grab these customers that are more and more regarding on a company involvement. And I think it goes beyond just consumer. It's also the talents in the company. Usually when I meet with large company, I tell them, Greta Thunberg is the example of maybe your next consumer, but it's also your next employee and your next CFO. And so if you don't, lead by example, you're going to not only lose this customer, but you also might lose people that might join your company because it's more and more, it's a bigger reason for people to join a company today.
So sustainability is really becoming part of the product strategy of a company. It's going from kind of a cost center, something that's focused on health and safety, and being part of something that you would actually incorporate into your product and integrate into your product.
Yeah, so I think that's exactly where it's going, where we are seeing that health and safety, and it was really around saving cost, and now it's about pushing innovation in products to make it obviously more sustainable, but also more attractive to this new consumer base. And so it's a competitive advantage for companies today to embrace.
Let's talk about regulation as well. This has been a field that, as you mentioned, has been driven largely by regulation in the past. Is regulation still a big factor as well?
Yes, and regulation is constantly growing. I think historically we've seen Europe being the main driver of environmental regulation. And same when I was in school in Europe, that was a big focus of what we were learning. And I always thought that it was making European company on average cleaner. But then I was interested to come in the US and work for a company here because the few companies that are driving sustainability here does it in a much more innovative way than sort of just compliance-wise. That said, the US is catching up in some ways as well in regulation. And obviously, some emerging countries, China, have been doing a really, really big push in the past 5 years. So we are seeing globally a rise in regulation and on a lot of different topics. I think at the beginning, it was mostly pollution management. Now we are seeing, obviously, things all the way to circularity regulation. So right now, Europe is drafting regulation to that is going to impact manufacturer to make every manufacturing product be disassembled and repairable. And I think that's going to be very disruptive for manufacturer, not only in Europe, but if you're an American manufacturer, you want to sell in Europe, you have to make sure that your product can be disassembled and repairable. I think we're still pretty far from getting this to this level. So regulation, it's a growing topic. Even me, I'm starting getting more and more into it to just really understand how this is driving the field of sustainability and also how we can help manufacturers and companies get ahead of that so they can really use sustainability as a competitive advantage and not just catching up on the market and the compliance piece of things.
Looking not just at sort of what's driving demand for sustainability, but also at what's available for manufacturers that want to become more sustainable today. What's going on sort of in technology, broadly speaking, that either contributes to sustainability or detracts from sustainability?
That's a great question. So a couple of things. I mean, the first one, I would say both the topic of regulation and consumer demand from a sustainable product are pushing the industry at large to commit to sustainability. And so I would say the first thing that we are really seeing at a high level is voluntary commitment to either compliance frameworks or voluntary standards, or I would say the most known and widely adopted today is the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And there is a specific goal around sustainable production and consumption that is really targeting consumer goods and manufacture. So that's sort of and what is interesting is that within this commitment, so for instance, organizations that are committing to the circular economy, they are starting understanding that they need to partner at an industry level. And so we're starting seeing partnership of what would traditionally be competitors. Today, I'm working with Cisco, and they work with their major competitor because they realize that they are all using the same suppliers in Southeast Asia for their electronic components, and they can't start asking, these suppliers different compliance frameworks or different information, and if they don't align into like the rules and what they are asking these suppliers to do, they won't reach the circular economy, or at least the KPIs that they are setting to themselves. So that's sort of something that is happening in the technology field, where I'm seeing more and more companies that are partnering for the greater good, which is great. From a technology perspective, how are we answering to all of these challenges is exactly what my job is at Autodesk. So I look at, what our technology and our tools can do today to support manufacturers and designers on embracing sustainability. And a lot of my work is also looking at the future of our tools. So if I stay a little bit today on like the current tools, honestly, the message is that if you use tools that are driving efficiencies in your product and you are trying to just improve the performance of your product, then it's probably also going to be more sustainable. So to give you an example, if you are trying to lightweight a part, you're probably doing it because it's going to be more cost effective. It's also driven by regulation, for instance. But hey, by the way, a lighter part is also going to require less energy to move around if it's in a car. So it's also going to require less material in the first place, and probably going to produce less waste and so forth. So all of that to say that you have sustainability benefits into applying efficiencies workflows. So from a today perspective, the idea is highlighting the sustainability benefit that you get from using technology, both from actually in three major areas. The first one is around material efficiencies. So how do you reduce the amount of material you're putting a product, reduce the amount of material you're generating in production, and then all the topic of circularity. The second topic is around energy efficiencies. And energy efficiency can be made at the product level. So how are you making your electronics more efficient from an energy standpoint? But you can also look at it from a factory or manufacturing level. How do you reduce the energy consumed in your production process, for instance, or the energy wasted in your production process? And then the third part is really around supply chain management, and how are you starting to spread these sustainability strategies and workflows into your supply chain down there. So that's from a today's perspective. In the tomorrow, what are the tools for tomorrow to support sustainability? We have some exciting work happening at Autodesk, where I'm working directly with Autodesk Research, as well as our product teams like Fusion, on really thinking what is the next generation of tools that will allow a designer to improve environmental performances of products. So I can't tell you much more about that, but it's exciting work happening, and it's really, I think the biggest point there is really to think about how we're making it as easy and effortless into the designer and the manufacturer process. I think experience-wise, we have seen that if a designer needs to use a different tool, or if it needs an extra couple of hours to go and research online alternative materials, it's just too much. There is already so much in a design brief to accomplish, then adding the layer of sustainability become a lower priority that is usually skipped. So part of my work into the future of our tools, it's really how are we embedding this into the designer process to make, to bring insight and information that help them make better decision.
You've made a really interesting and important distinction here in that there are ways to improve the sustainability of a product, both in the way that it's manufactured and distributed and in the way that it performs. If you're a product developer, how would you go about kind of like evaluating that trade-off? If you have an opportunity to make a product perform more effectively or last longer or be more repairable, but maybe there's a trade-off in manufacturing. Are there kind of frameworks or ways that product developers can kind of like evaluate this stuff pretty quickly and understand what the trade-offs are?
Yes, so it's a good point to really think about sort of the design phase, and it's something that we call embodied impact that is just coming from the material itself. And then you have what we call the full life cycle that is really taking into account all of the life stages of a product from including the manufacturing phase as well as the end of life and so forth. So where do you start chunking so that you have the right estimate? The golden standard is the life cycle assessment. It is really hard to measure and to do. So I think it's good to have very simple frameworks in mind. And this is my own framework, so not that I'm saying it's official, but the way I'm thinking about it is that if you have a product that is not using any energy, so I'm talking about a water bottle or a glass or furniture, really, really roughly 80% of the environmental impact of this product is in its material. So the material choices is very critical when you have a product that is not using any type of energy. And I would say then within thinking about that, then thinking about material is definitely going to lead the type of manufacturing process that you're going to choose into that. So for products that don't use energy, that's where I would spend a lot of time thinking about the efficiency of your manufacturing processes. If your product uses any type of energy, so if it's a car, if it's an electronics, the shift totally where, again, probably 80% of the environmental impact come from the use phase. So actually the use of energy. So for a car, you can, and then it's an argument. You could argue that it's very important the type of material that you put in your car, but it's actually more important to think about how you make it efficient in the use phase. So trying to drive as low as fuel usage per mileage and stuff as possible, because that's the biggest environmental impact there. So that's my own frameworks that is just very easy to think. That is like, if it's a simple, and I'm saying simple, like it's a product that is not using energy, it can be a complex product. Mm-hmm. It's very important to look at the material and the manufacturing process, what we call the embodied impact. And if it's a product that uses energy, really think about the design of your product to drive efficiencies on the use phase of this product.
That's a fantastic framework. I think it's incredibly helpful because a lot of us, and we'll get into 3D printing in a second, but a lot of what people sort of intuitively understand about 3D printing is that its environmental impact is about the material that the printer uses and kind of how that goes through its life cycle. But what you're describing is very relevant to this because it kind of, in terms of both using 3D printers themselves and in terms of what you do with a 3D printed part, there's this constant trade-off between the embodied energy of the manufacturing process and the lifetime, energy usage or environmental impact of the part itself.
Yeah, and I think you can take the example of, maybe let's take an example of a product. Like, would you 3D print a water glass, for instance, or would you 3D print car parts? And, I would argue that there is probably better way of making a water glass than 3D printing it, because it's something where you can find, using glass. Glass is one of the most sustainable material because it's infinitely recyclable, for instance. So why would you use 3D printing for that? Versus for a car part, since car uses energy, you want to lightweight as much as possible. You want to make like parts that can solve complex problems for this car. And that's where I think 3D printing and additive manufacturing can really play a role, because they can make this part as lightweight as possible. They can make it very complex with very few waste in production and so forth. And overall, it will help the car uses less energy, which is really where you want to reduce the impact in a car again. So yeah, I think it is helpful to think about it that way.
On the last episode of this podcast, I spoke with Jeremy Faludi, who's done a lot of research on the environmental sustainability of 3D printing. And his advice to 3D printer operators was the kind of counterintuitive advice that basically you should operate the printer as much as possible, because the utilization of the printer itself is one of the biggest drivers of environmental impact, that there's a lot of embodied energy in the printer, that a lot of 3D printers use almost as much energy when they're idling as when they're actually running. And so the impact of the materials is quite a lot lower than the energy impact of the printer itself, and you want to get utilization as high as possible. From a product developer or a prototyper or a designer standpoint, are there other tools that you can use to improve the environmental impact of 3D printing, ways that you can sort of change the way that you use 3D printing, ways that you can design parts differently, stuff like that?
Yeah. So first of all, I totally agree with Jeremy on the impact of the printer themselves. So it's the same story with the car. Like, I would say something that the field of 3D printing could really do is start designing printers that are more energy efficient. And we should do it as we're thinking about making efficient cars the same way. That said, when you start drilling down a little bit, there is something around just the part geometries that you're trying to print and how it impacts. And the very simplistic way of thinking about it is like, think about printing a solid cube versus a shallow cube, a shell. It's just going to take so much more time, so much more material. It does totally make sense that it's more impactful. And again, to connect to Jeremy, if it takes more time, it's going to use more energy, and that's the biggest impact in additive manufacturing. So actually, the geometry of the parts that you are printing is directly related to the environmental impact, and because of the printer usage and the time that you're going to take to print. So things to think about is definitely anything that is shell part, shallow, anything like latticing. So you want to have as least material as possible that you print, since the time that the printer takes is directly related to the amount of material that you are using. So that's the really first one to think about, as well as your part orientation in your printer. And if you put that a little bit, another strategy that I like to talk about in additive manufacturing is around stacking. And so, we have nesting in 2D that is really around just putting all the patterns as close as possible so you can reduce the amount of waste that you produce. Same principle with packing in 3D. You want to try to put all of the parts, first of all, try to print as many parts as possible at once so that your printer is just on for a specific period of time, and then you turn it off. Again, just stop idling your machine. It's the worst. Then the second thing is like stack them up. It will make your print process faster. And then the extra benefit is that you have less support material, and support material in our field goes directly to waste. And so again, additive manufacturing per se is a process that uses or generates less waste than subtractive manufacturing. That said, it's still some type of waste that are usually not recyclable at all. And so you want to minimize the amount of support material. So we at Autodesk have tools that could help do that. Like, first of all, on the geometry part, we have generative design that really drives optimized geometry for additive manufacturing, so that really you only have the material you need for the product performances that you are looking for. And so that's exciting for us. You're obviously using less material in the first place. You're making a part that is lighter, so in the case that it will be put in a product that will use energy, it's better. And then you also generate less waste. And we also have some software like NetFab that is really around optimization for additive manufacturing that can look at latticing. So even in like stronger structure, putting some lattice geometry that will create some holes and make your part lighter. And then the stacking part where it's going to optimize your print process. It's going to automatically stack your parts and the orientation of them so you can reduce the supports material overall.
This all kind of falls under the practice of design for additive manufacturing. That's something that a lot of people in the 3D printing world talk about. The observation being that many users of 3D printers kind of see them as a magic box and you throw your part in and then it, and the software around 3D printing tends to support this. You take any arbitrary part, you throw it into the software, it orients it, builds supports, and then you're done. But for careful 3D printing, the design is crucial, and understanding not only what the opportunities of 3D printing are in terms of creating parts that fit their purpose and so on, but also understanding the process and figuring out how the part that you're making is really going to get manufactured.
Yes, so critical. The geometry is definitely critical in additive manufacturing. And obviously, I think the complexity comes also from there are different types of additive manufacturing that uses different material. And to your point, I think we see additive manufacturing as a magic box. And it's not, because you have to take into consideration the material and the printer and the process that you are using. And maybe that's not more or less complicated than any other type of manufacturing, because at some point it is a trade-off about the type of material and the manufacturing process that are available to you, and how do you work these hand in hand. And I think it's one of the most complex thing in our field today. Is like either you're a designer or you're a manufacturer, but you have these roles actually pretty separated. And so you have a designer that says, oh, I want a shiny black thing. And then the manufacturer is like, I don't know what type of material I'm going to use to do that, and so forth. So it's like, I think it's evident in printing because it's so easy to screw up a print, but these challenges has been on the field for a very long time. I think what is exciting is that we are seeing at this Autodesk really merging the design and the manufacturing process together, so it's getting closer and closer. The roles are getting closer and closer. The collaboration can happen earlier in the design process, so that you don't have to screw up a print and then learn from that and then the other one. So
that's really exciting. Your point is basically that as a designer, you now bear more responsibility for sustainability than you did in a world, say, 20 years ago, where you just created a design and then sent it to some manufacturer that had to figure out how to make it. You'd like make a 2D, drafting of whatever it is that you want to do. Now, as the designer, as the product developer, you sit much more centrally in the process of actually making the part, and you have some control over this, right?
Totally. And, we have a little data point in the sustainability world that said that about 80% of environmental impact is locked at the design phase. So actually, after the concept design phase, there is very little room that you can take to actually reduce environmental impact. And so what we are seeing is that by bringing more of the later process to the designer, they are able to make better decision at this critical phase that is like concept phase. And what is exciting is that I'm seeing more and more designer understanding the responsibility that it is for them. I think for a long time, they were thinking about material selection as making a shiny black thing. And now they are starting asking more and more questions about, wait, where does this material is going to go afterwards, and so forth, and really starting to take on the responsibility that they have on material selection, shape, function of the product. Obviously, this disassembly part is really critical, and so forth. So, yes.
And it sounds like kind of the direction of computer-aided design software is going hand in hand with this, exposing more of the manufacturing process back to the designer at the point of design, right? So that as you're changing your design, you can actually see how the manufacturing process, how the fabrication around it has to change.
Exactly. And the idea is really bringing more and more insight to let the designer make this better decision. And it's the same with manufacturing process as well as sustainability. And I think for me, when we'll be able to put at the same level of information, cost, manufacturability, and environmental impact, that's really, and make it as easy as possible to assess the three indicator at the same time, that's really where we're going to see the field picking up sustainability. Because right now it's like, well, I still need to make sure I can manufacture it and it needs to be under discuss. And if I can prove both of that, then maybe I'll add the sustainability piece of that, But I think that if you can make it very simple to have this information in front of a designer as early as possible into their design phase, and then let them explore different options and make trades-off. The trades-off are still made by the designer. It's just that the designer has all the technology to simulate and to provide them with the right information that they need to make this decision. And hopefully they make the decision toward the better for them, for their product, for the company, and for the planet.
Let me ask you kind of a higher level strategic question. If you're, say, the head of product at a company or you're running a company and you want to evaluate your whole operation and see what your weaknesses are in terms of sustainability and figure out what you could improve most readily in terms of the total, footprint of all of your manufactured products, what would you start? How do you go about that process?
So if we take this process in particular, I would really refer to lean manufacturing as, I would say the grandfather of what we called sustainable manufacturing today. At a high level, lean manufacturing was about reduction of waste at different level. Waste is one of the strategies in sustainable manufacturing, so I think it goes beyond. But the strategy that you would take to implement lean manufacturing in your company is very similar of how you would implement sustainable manufacturing. So I would start with just a baseline of evaluating and assessing your environmental impact, and then just start taking the low-hanging fruit. From a manufacturing standpoint, most of it is always around energy efficiencies. So I think in average, it's almost like 35 to 40% of a manufacturing energy usage is HVAC system and LED and heating and cooling. So actually like thinking about how you're designing your factory, your, HVAC system, your pipe, and thinking about how you can make that more efficient is definitely something where you can save a lot. Then looking at your waste is another one. Definitely waste in production is the second biggest impact after that. And then what I would say is that maybe that's really from an operation perspective. Again, I would go, and that's a risk management. So that's kind of the old school of thinking about sustainability. Then take all of this learning and bring it to the management phase of the company, like show how you can really drive competitive advantage. You can market, you can talk to your customer about all of the efforts that you've done in your factory, in your process lines and so forth. And then how can you bring that into the design of your product in the first place?
Zoé, I'd like to ask you the question I ask everyone on this podcast. Since it's a podcast about sort of manufacturing, we talk a lot about tools. So tell me about your favorite tool these days.
From a manufacturing perspective, I like to consider myself a maker, definitely more on a Sunday afternoon maker, but, and also I've turned to be zero waste for about a year and a half now. It's definitely aspiring zero waste and it's in progress, but one of the part is that I stopped buying anything new, and particularly for gifts. And so I love to come and use the shop for making my own gifts. I have a lot of baby nephews. They're popping up everywhere. And my favorite tool in the shop is the simple laser cutter. I do a lot with it. I think I can also reuse a lot of materials. So I found, waste plywood in the shop or acrylic that I can just reuse. I love making paper lamps. So they're like paper shadow lamps that I use, and it's always I always think about the material that I'm putting in there. So it's like paper and cardboard, and then it's like plywood, natural glue to that, and what it is. So I would say most of the time my go-to is laser cutting. I spend a lot of time with it, like play a lot with a lot of different material. And I think it's a very versatile tool.
It's such an easy tool for just going really quickly from design to part. I mean, to open up like, Adobe Illustrator, and 10 minutes later you can have what it is that you need.
Yeah, I spent some time trying to do CNC, and after, 60 hours on my computer doing my toolpath and then getting on the machine, and another 60 hours on not making the machine work at all, and few white hair and cries in between, I decided to stick with a pretty simple tool that at least get me to a good gift for my family without having to buy anything in the store.
It's kind of eternal advice, fit the tool to the need, and this does it. Well, Zoé, it's been a pleasure to speak with you today. If listeners want to find out more about the work that you're doing, where should they look?
So autodesk.com/sustainability, you'll find a lot of information about our strategy around even like circular design, some of our tools, and how our customers are using our tools for sustainability. So go and check it out, and feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions.
Zoé Bezpalko, thank you so much for coming on the program today.
Thank you, John.
The Digital Factory podcast is brought to you by Formlabs. The new Form 3 desktop SLA 3D printer lets you print fabulously detailed, high-quality parts in a wide range of materials, and it scales from your desktop to your factory. Visit formlabs.com for more information. And remember to check out the next episode in your podcast app. This is a conversation between Rob Carter, the CIO of FedEx, and Jeff Immelt, and it's taken from the Digital Factory conference back in May. We're going to be making a few of the presentations from the conference that work well in audio format available here on the Digital Factory podcast so that you can listen to them wherever you are. But you can see all of the presentations, all of the panels, all of the keynotes at thedigitalfactory.com. For the Digital Factory podcast, I'm Jon Bruner.